Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We are from Group 3 and our topic is the prohibition to attack those who are sick, wounded, prisoner of war under the international humanitarian law. For the introduction, the international humanitarian law is a set of rules which seek for humanitarian reason to limit the effect of the armed conflict. It protects persons who are not or no longer participating in the hostilities and restrict the means and method of warfare. Each basic principle should be found within the specific rules and the norms of IHL itself, but the principle may also help interpretation of the law when the legal issue are unclear or controversial. Depending on the issue, the balance between the principle and the interest shift. For example, during hostilities, military necessity may limit the notion of humanity by allowing for destruction. But in other situations, such as the protection of wounded and sick, the principle of humanity is at the heart of the legal rules. The prohibition to attack any person, those who are sick and wounded, and also prisoners of war, is a fundamental rule under the IHL. For example, while a soldier could be targeted lawfully under normal circumstances, if that soldier surrender or is wounded and no longer poses a threat, then it is prohibited to attack the person.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is NURULHUDA ABDULLAH and my metric number 046244 and I am from Group 3. And today I would like to talk about the Rule 47 of ICRC under Customary International Humanitarian Law, which is attacks against persons forced to combat. So under Rule 47, which means attacking persons who are recognized as forced to combat is prohibited. There are three categories, which is first, anyone who is in the power of an adverse party, and second, anyone who is defenseless because of unconsciousness, shipwreck, and wounds or sickness, and three, anyone who clearly expresses an intention to surrender. It is provided when he or she abstains from any hostile act and does not attempt to escape. So a person forced to combat is a person who is no longer participating in hostilities by choice or circumstances. So under customary international law, a person can be replaced by the forced to combat in three situations that I mentioned just now, but I will go deeper about the three categories of which just now is anyone who in the power of an adverse party. So under these categories, it is uncontested that a person who is in the power of an adverse party is forced to combat. So this rule is set forth in Additional Protocol 1 and is implicit in Common Article 3 of the Geneva Convention and in Additional Protocol 2. And it has been also confirmed in numerous military manuals, and respect for and protection of persons who are in the power of an adverse party is a cornerstone of international humanitarian law, as reflected in several provisions of the Geneva Convention and additional protocols. Practice, therefore, focuses rather on treatment to be given to such person. And the second, anyone who is defenseless because of unconsciousness, shipwreck, wounds, or sickness. So this category is based on the Hague Regulation, Common Article 3 of the Geneva Convention and Additional Protocol 1, which prohibit attacks on defenseless person. It is found in numerous military manuals, and it is contained in the legislation of many states, and also supported by case law official statements and other practice such as instruction to armed forces. In addition, respect for and protection of wounded, sick and shipwrecked, also a cornerstone of international humanitarian law, applicable in both international and non-international armed conflict as reflected in several provisions of the Geneva Convention and their addition protocols. And lastly, anyone who clearly indicates an intention to surrender. So this category also based on Hague Regulation, Common Article 3 of Geneva Convention and Additional Protocol 1. It is contained numerous military manuals included in national legislation of many states. And the general tenets that emerge from this practice is that a clear indication of unconditional surrender render a person of horse the combat. So in land warfare, a clear intention to surrender is generally shown by laying down one's weapon and raising one's hand. Other examples, such as emerging from one's position displaying a white flag, are mentioned in many military manuals. And next is quarter under unusual circumstances of combat, also under the Rule of 47, which the prohibition on attacking person is recognized as hostile combat, applies in all circumstances, even when it is difficult to keep or evacuate prisoners. For example, when a small patrol operating in isolation captures combatants, such practical difficulties must be overcome by disarming and releasing the person concerned according to the Additional Protocol 1. I think that's
Hello,
all.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is AMIRUL FAIZ bin ROSLAN, metric number 046391. Today I would like to present to you about international armed conflict. According to conventional international humanitarian law, this term describes armed conflicts between two or more states, cases of military occupation of all or part of the territory of a high contracting party, as well as wars of national liberation. The definition of Common Article 2 covers cases of declared wars as well as any armed conflict where the state of war has not been recognized. Since 1949, the application of international humanitarian law is no longer dependent on the formalism of a war declaration or the recognition of a state of belligerency by one of the concerned state. This definition is based on the objective criteria intended to avoid the political polemics on the qualification. The law applicable to international armed conflict also covers all of the case of partial or total occupation of the territory of a high contracting party, even if the said occupation meets with no armed resistance and there are therefore no armed clashes, or if those armed clashes are with non-state armed groups on the territory of the occupied state. The first additional protocol of 1977 considers that wars of national liberation in which a population is fighting against colonial domination, foreign occupation, or racist regimes are international armed conflicts. In general, this is also the case, the case for wars resulting from people's attempts to exercise their right to self-determination. The law of international armed conflicts can therefore apply to this type of conflict on the condition that the authority representing the people involved in the conflict formally agrees to implement the Geneva Convention and its first additional protocol. Conventional and customary international humanitarian law do not give a clear definition of the notion of armed conflict. The commentary on Common Article 2 specifies that any difference arising between two states and leading to the intervention of members of the armed forces is an armed conflict within the meaning of the Geneva Conventions, even if one of the parties denies the existence of a state of war. The commentary states that the duration of the conflict, the number of deaths, and the number of military forces involved makes no difference on the qualification of the conflict. The simple fact that the armed forces of one of the parties have captured members of the adverse armed forces, even if there have been no death, is sufficient to activate the law applicable to international armed conflict. Therefore, the existence of an international armed conflict does not depend on any requirement regarding to the threshold of violence and the intensity of the armed clashes, contrary to the rules applicable to internal armed conflicts.
Okay, now I will explain about non-international armed conflict. Okay, under Article 3, common to the Geneva Convention, 1949, non-international armed conflict are armed conflicts in which one or more non-state armed groups are involved, depending on the situation. Hostilities may occur between governmental armed forces and non-armed groups or situations, or between such groups only. Okay, IHL requires that two criteria must be met for there to be a non-international armed conflict. Okay, the first one, the armed groups involved must show a minimum degree of organization, and the second one, the armed confrontations must reach a minimum level of intensity. Okay, the fulfillment of this criteria is determined on a case-by-case basis by weighing up a number of factual indicators. Okay, for the level of intensity of violence is determined in light of indicators such as the duration and gravity of armed clashes, the type of government forces involved, fighters. Okay, there are difference between NIAC and civil war, which is the parties to non-international armed conflicts are at minimum required to comply with Article 3, common to the Geneva Conventions, and with rules of customary international humanitarian law. Among the rules that the parties to an army conflict must respect when conducting hostilities, there is the prohibition of direct attacks against civilians, the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks, the obligation to respect the principle of proportionality in attack, the obligation to take feasible precautions in planning and executing military operations, so as to avoid as far as possible civilian casualties. Okay, that's all from me. Thank you.
Next is medical and religious personnel. Medical personnel such as doctors, nurses, that assigned whether on a permanent or temporary basis exclusively to medical purpose, and religious personnel include persons, whether military or civilian, who are dedicated exclusively to the exercise of their ministry. So, Convention 1 and 2 of Geneva Convention aim to safeguard and ensure the treatment of the sick, wounded and shipwrecked. Also provide protection to medical personnel, administrative aid and religious personnel, so they cannot be target on the battlefield and can perform their medical or religious duties. When the adverse party has captured them, permanent medical and religious personnel must not be treated as prisoner of war and should be maintained only if it is required to care for prisoner of war. So IHL does not include any specific provision under any of the special privilege by medical personnel. However, there are specific guidelines as to the lack of special right to fix medical personnel. Such guidelines are applicable to medical professionals and such laws are accepted. So special protection is lost when they participate in hostilities which damage the enemy beyond their humanitarian duties, but only after they had given warning and time limit to stop the action. So there is debate about what count as action harming to the enemy. If medical personnel are actively involved in hostilities, that their protection will lose as civilian. And the effect and duration of such lack of protection are once again problematic for military medical personnel. Some argue that as a member of the armed force, they turn into combatants who turn into prisoner of war if captured, and others consider that as soon as they no longer perform harmful act to the enemy, they regain protection as medical personnel, meaning that they will be deported back if they fall into the power of the enemy. So for example, in the case of helicopter attack on ambulance in Lebanon, on December 1987, 2 ambulances suffered a direct hit by helicopter gunfire during a military operation in southern Lebanon. A first aid worker was wounded, while 2 Scot first aiders and a patient in the other ambulance were killed. So the ICRC is seriously disappointed to find that first aid personnel are once again becoming the victim of hostilities while performing their humanitarian duty. So the ICRC delegation in Lebanon is deeply saddened by this event and calls on the parties involved to honor the representation of the Red Cross that protect those who provide assistance to all the victims. So it shows that this case violated the principle of IHL as it is prohibit attack against sick, wounded and prisoner of war.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So I believe all of my group members already explained in general about Rule 47, which is the prohibition to attack those who are sick, wounded, prisoners of war under the international humanitarian law. So my part is I'm going to explain about the case study under this rule. So I picked the case of Israel versus Palestine. Okay, this case is actually the Operation Protective Edge, which happened in Gaza in 13 June until 26 August 2014. So this case study is based on the research made by the United Nations, which is the report of the Independent Commission of Inquiry into the Gaza conflict of 2014. Okay, what are focusing in this case that violating the rules of 47? So according to the Commission of the United Nations, who actually did the research regarding this matter, is the view that inmates that were transferred out of the prison and summarily executed without the knowledge of the local authorities of Gaza have been violated their rights. So what kind of right have been violated? One of the example is the murder and torture. Okay, since those who violated their right is the prisoner of war, even though they are the Israeli, and we all know that Israeli is the one that actively combat the Palestinian compared to Palestine counterattack. So all we can see also Palestinian always the victim, but in this case the prisoner of war is the victim no matter which parties they are. Why? Because they are prisoner of war, they are defenseless, they have no power or ability to to protect themselves and to defend themselves. So they being violated their rights when they are defenseless. So all I can say, Israeli and Palestinian case is just one of the case study among many others case study that violating the rules of 47 under the international humanitarian law.
So for the conclusion, the Charter has not completely outlawed the use of force. Indeed, state retain the right to defend themselves individually or collectively against attack on their independence on their territory in response to legal or illegal use of force. But it also prohibited the use of force does not encompass internal armed conflict or civil war. So, international humanitarian law, the principle of which can be found in all major religion and culture, set out only basic protection. But once we look to demonstrate that even during armed conflict, there is some common sense of and respect for humanity. In modern international humanitarian law is not naive and accepts that harm, destruction and death can be lawful during armed conflict. Okay, and international humanitarian law simply looks to limit the harm, and the principle of humanity is very much at the heart of this ambition, because as we all know, under the international humanitarian law is strictly prohibited to attack any person, those who are sick and wounded, and many rules of international humanitarian law are inspired by this notion, specifically those setting up protection for the wounded and people who are sick. Thank you.